I was very surprised by what Chancellor Merkel said going into this conference in Durban. Because if you're going into a conference, you don't predict the outcome in advance. That doesn't help you achieve your ends. I don't understand why she did so. The German negotiating position as part of the EU is that we are going for a deal here. And so it seemed to me really rather incomprehensible that she would wish to make a statement like this on the eve of the conference. The debate in Durban is not about whether developing countries take on binding commitments now, which none of them are prepared to do in a legal form. Many will say, of course, they are taking on binding commitments at home. They've made national laws, they've got national policies which are binding on them. But this issue of whether those should be binding in an international agreement is still difficult. The developing countries are in a kind of transition from a world in which they believe that their obligations to act on climate change were really secondary to those of the developed countries. Historically, it is the developed countries that have caused this problem, and therefore it wasn't surprising that the position taken by developing countries historically, right from the beginning of the UN Convention in 1992, was that it was developed countries' responsibility to solve the problem. What's happened over the last few years is that it's become clear that it can't only be the responsibility of developed countries, because future emissions are mostly coming from the developing ones. This is the larger developing ones: India, China, Brazil, Indonesia, and so on. But, of course, we're not dealing now with a negotiation about what should happen next year, but about what should happen in 2017, 2018, perhaps even after 2020. And in that time period, I think many developing countries, many emerging economies do realise that they will need to take on binding commitments after then. What I think is interesting about the negotiations going on here in Durban is that the developing countries are no longer acting as a single bloc. In the past, the G77 group, which includes all the developing economies and China, have acted together and negotiated together. And it's now clear that there are big differences between the least developed countries, the very poorest countries, the small island states, which are the most vulnerable ones, and the big developing countries, the so-called basic group: Brazil, India, China, and South Africa. And they're no longer trying to claim that they all have one voice. And that means that the internal pressures amongst developing countries are very different. And I do think that with the vulnerable countries and the poorest countries now calling for the Kyoto Protocol to be extended, but also for the beginning of negotiations involving all countries towards a new legally binding agreement that would cover everybody, I think the fact that they're calling for that so hard is changing the dynamic. And that's why I think that it is possible that we will get such an agreement, because I don't think that India, South Africa, Brazil and China want to be seen as on the side of the United States. And there's no doubt that in the period running up to 2008, 2009, the possibility, for example, of developed countries giving financial assistance to developing ones was really quite good, that there was a willingness in good economic times to help in that way. And now there's no question that that's much harder. There's much less money to go around. And the confidence in the economic system on which investment is based, and it is investment in low carbon energy and so on, which will drive action against climate change. That investment now is much more difficult because of the economic climate. So it's had a big effect in the willingness of politicians and the amount of money that can be devoted to this. What hasn't yet been realised, it seems to me, is that there's also a huge opportunity here. The European economy and much of the developed world economy are in real trouble. Not just because of the debt overhang, but because it's not clear where growth is going to come from. Germany, in a sense, is the one exception in Europe which has now resumed growth, but most of Europe, including the United Kingdom, has almost no growth. And in those circumstances, low carbon investment can be seen as a form of stimulus and of long-term benefit, which actually could support a recovery from the economic crisis as well as reducing emissions. And that connection has not been properly made yet, and that's what really now has to be made. We should be investing in low-carbon energy and transport and so on, not just to reduce emissions, but to get us out of our economic problems.